I'm going to talk a little bit about tackling bias in women's health device development and some general things about women's health in medtech for this talk today. Maybe if my slides will move, there we go. So I work for RQM Plus. We talked a little bit about this, but we just launched a new brand campaign. We don't make medtech, we make medtech happen. So just a little bit about RQM Plus. If you're not familiar, we have a full suite of medtech services for the whole product lifecycle. That includes consulting services for regulatory and quality consulting, clinical trials. We have a full service CRO, lab services through our Geordie Labs, as well as reimbursement services. If you're not following us on LinkedIn, please do so. We put out a lot of great content. This month, we're focusing on women's health, so lots of great initiatives happening there. We have another live show happening later this month. Let's talk about women's health. Let's talk about women's health campaign, a blog series coming out. So lots of great things happening. We're always doing new stuff. Okay. And then just a little bit about our expertise, and then I'll stop the salesy stuff and get into the content. Okay, so women's health and medtech. I think it's important to frame the discussion to talk about money, because that's what makes the world go round. So investments in women's health have really skyrocketed recently. We've seen about a 20-year high in 2024 in investment in women's health. And the market is currently valued at $52 billion in 2023, projected to double by 2029.
This
So
is my first time seeing that expression, femtech. Is that
yeah.
unfamiliar to anyone? Raise your hand if you've seen or used that expression. You can do it virtually if you want to click on the up button. Okay. Thanks.
So yeah, so you can see down here the breakdown by therapeutic area, 2023 in gray, 2024 in yellow, and women's health between 2023 and 2024 really has jumped up in terms of research investment dollars being put into the industry. I think it's also important to note that women influence 80% of healthcare decisions. So even though women make up only about 50% of the population, they're making most of the healthcare decisions for their families and for themselves. And so I think that's also frames this in a way that, you know, we should care what women think, what women are using, what women do. To just take a little bit of a look back at where we started, where we came from in the US, we didn't see any specific inclusion of women in research until 1986, when the NIH established a policy encouraging inclusion of women in clinical research. 1990, there was an Office of Research on Women's Health established. And then in 1993, we saw the first requirement of inclusion of women and minorities in NIH-sponsored clinical trials. So this is, 22 years ago was the first time women were required to be included in a clinical trial. 1994, we saw the Office of Women's Health established. 1998, the FDA issued demographic rule, which basically meant they had to capture demographic data as part of clinical trials. In 2000, the NIH launched the Women's Health Initiative. And then more recently, in the last 10 to 11 years, FDA has started to put out some specific guidance on this. So 2014, there was guidance on evaluation of sex-specific data in medical device clinical studies. 2018 on inclusion of pregnant women in studies. 2020 on enhancing diversity for clinical trials. And then in 2022, the first draft guidance for the diversity action plans were published. So you can really see that this is a newer effort. The last 20 years has really been it for women being included in research for medical devices and for clinical trials in general. And really only very recently have there been any specific guidance on how to do that analysis, how to include pregnant women who have typically been excluded. We could see a very similar timeline for Europe. So 1997, EMA started encouraging inclusion of women in clinical trials and analysis of data by sex. So the US, I think it was 1986 was the first encouragement. In Europe, it's even later, but at least they're also analyzing the data by sex at that point. 2001 Clinical Trials Directive was adopted, which had some specific considerations around demographics, populations included in studies. 2005, EMA released guidance on the investigation of medicinal products in women. 2005 was the first guidance for medicinal products in women. 20 years. 2010, there was an initiative to kind of improve the use of women and gender-specific considerations in clinical trials. 2014, we saw clinical trial regulation come into play, which strengthens requirements for inclusions of women and underrepresented groups. 2017, we have IVDR and MDR established. So those also require, more specific requirements around populations of intended use to be, researched and evidence provided prior to placing devices on the market. 2018, we saw guidance on the inclusion of sex and gender in analysis. And then 2020, Europe EMA provided guidance on including pregnant and breastfeeding women. So this is very new. I think it was shocking to me when I pulled up these numbers how recent some of these things happened. But just putting it in perspective. When we look at today, some trends and innovations happening in the industry. For medical devices, we see surgical solutions for endometriosis being big in the field, wearables and biofeedback devices for injury prevention and family planning, transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation for menstrual pain, and a lot of AI-driven health monitoring for breast cancer and other diseases. On the IVD side, there's a lot happening as well. We're seeing a lot of point of care, a move towards point of care for HPV and STI screening. Breast cancer diagnosis and monitoring remains really high in the diagnostic space. Pregnancy and ovulation kits, we're seeing some technological advances with AI. So where you can take a picture of your ovulation strip and the AI will determine, a concentration based on the line, how dark the line is. So that's pretty cool. And then, yep. Someone have something to say?
Yeah, just very cool.
Yeah, really cool. And also non-invasive prenatal testing. So we could do genetic testing now based on blood samples taken from the mother, and they're actually able to separate out fetal DNA from the mother's DNA. So also really, really cool advancements there. Some things that have been in the news recently that also relate to women's health. So some more biofeedback, so preventing ACL injury with 3D motion analysis. Some plant extracts and early leads against breast cancer. New procedures, laparoscopic procedures for fibroid ablation and alleviating pain. So this would normally be a surgical, invasive surgical procedure with a hysterectomy involved. They're looking at ways to reduce that hysterectomy rate and treat the fibroids in other ways. And then digital health tools for cardiac risk determinations. So lots happening in the space. That being said, there's still a lot of challenges that are here that we're facing. those timelines I showed you, late adoption of considerations for women's health within the medical device design. So only very recently were companies required to even think about women when they were making devices. And a lot of things, were not designed to be used by women, and they just are being used by women. So a good example here is face masks. So face masks, all the standards for face masks were based on a man's face. And during COVID, it was actually found that the N95s did not fit women's faces properly. And so women were having to over tighten their masks, which is uncomfortable. And it's all because the standards to create the masks were based on some man in Scotland, like some guy's face was like the mold they used to create all the masks. And that's definitely because of late adoption, right? Nobody told them they had to use women, and so they never did. And that's still continuing today. Also, AI design and training, there can be huge bias introduced if you don't design your AI correctly, don't have all the correct inputs, and if you don't train it with a diverse data set, you can really end up in a place where you're misdiagnosing, or your AI is not proper for women or for certain groups. And then design verification and validation do not always include representative groups for testing. So if your device is like a gender or sex neutral, you still have to make sure you're using representative groups. Otherwise, there may be bias introduced that you don't know about. We'll get into that more. Excuse me. So there are challenges, but there's a lot of opportunities. Because women were left to the wayside for so long, there's a lot of opportunities for new treatment options specifically designed for women. There's a lot of places this space could go. And there is that significant investment that we talked about earlier. So let's talk a little bit about bias within the design development life cycle. I think it's important to note, we talk a lot about sex differences in clinical trials and making sure you have representative groups in clinical trials. But really, this bias can be introduced anywhere within the product life cycle. So concept, the device is developed with a male-dominated idea, even if the person designing it doesn't realize that.
Tell me about that. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so a man comes up with an idea for something, and
But why is that yours? Why are you starting there? Why doesn't woman come up with an idea for something?
Yeah, a woman could come up for an idea, and then it could be biased towards men the other way, right? It goes both ways for sure. So I think this is all about, we all have our own bias as people, right? And you're going to think about yourself and the world around you when you're performing tasks.
So are
right?
you saying that medical devices is a male-dominated field and therefore more ideas come from men?
That's true, I think, yes.
But is that your point?
Yeah. I think that's my point. I think not that it always comes with a male-dominated idea, but that it can, right? I think my point is that this can happen at as early as design, right? As early as thinking about like how something fits into somebody's hand, right? If you don't think about like a woman surgeon using a tool, then you may run into an issue later, right? If you're just thinking about dexterity, like all of these different considerations.
I'm even, it's not my field, of course, but I'm imagining how would I change a tool for a woman's hand versus a man's?
The grip size, the how far apart like if you have to grab something, right? So your hand is going to be bigger than a woman's.
Do you think most, I don't know, typical tools that you'd find in an OR, for example, can support a market of the man size and the woman size?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but happy to hear if anybody else has any inputs, any thoughts.
Suspect this is not why you have your hand raised, Andre, but you have something to contribute.
Yeah, no, it's not about that. Just Margot, we had an interesting case where we were developing a therapeutic device for one of our customers, and they went to a CRO to create the study. And one of their entry criteria was that they wanted both men and women in equal amounts to be tested. And the CRO said that they could not do that, that it would be impossible to run the study if they had to include equal amounts of men and women. So I don't know if that was a bias against women or just something that was not practical for them.
That's interesting. I mean, I think it would depend on what the device was, and there's a lot of considerations there, right? But I'm kind of surprised at that CRO's reaction.
Yeah, it was actually an electrical stimulation device for biofeedback. And I mean, we weren't directly involved. We were developing the device for them. But I know that they were concerned that they said, well, they can't actually allow for the 50-50 split on men and women.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I might look at some other CROs.
Right.
Okay. So design, I think this is really, if a device is considered sex neutral, different use cases and residual risks are often considered sex neutral. And then you never get into that deep dive of, is there a difference, right? So if you don't look at the data, you don't know if it exists. So starting from a place of assumption that your device is sex neutral can lead to some bias. Validation. So this is where we traditionally think about bias in terms of sex differences. Your validation doesn't include sufficient differentiation. Your usability studies are not done on representative populations, and your clinical trial did not have a representative group. And then post-market surveillance. Again, if you're not looking for the difference, you're not stratifying your data that way. And you would not show specific issues, even if they were there for female populations.
So I heard an interesting case recently, and
Sure.
it was a notified body who shall remain nameless, and they the medical device was a hospital bed, and they came back and they said, has this hospital bed been tested for pregnant women? And the company said, we don't know. And they said, well, guess what? You have to take that off your population, intended population, intended use list, because you don't have any evidence that this hospital bed is suitable for pregnant women. Comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that shows that the industry and the regulators are moving to a place where they want to see specific data. I think I'm not an expert in hospital beds, so I'm not gonna get into whether I think that was an appropriate question or not. I think that is definitely shows that IVDR and MDR both, are going to require population-specific data for any claims that are being made for the device.
Great by your example in red.
Yeah, so risk management. So this is a real life example of an RQM Plus consultant who was supporting a risk management, a risk assessment for a client, and they were doing the risk assessment for a breast pump, and they ranked severity of harm for leakage of pumped milk as very low. The engineers on the project didn't see an issue with this, but if they had talked to any single human being who had ever pumped milk with a breast pump, this would not be a low severity issue. This is a major issue for somebody who is using a breast pump.
Now, is it a major issue? Because it's like, that's a pain in the ass, but
Right,
is that really a safety issue?
right. That was my question.
Like that doesn't mean that severity of harm
Right.
but it's a user preference, but that doesn't make it a risk, a high risk.
So
It
it
makes it
doesn't
not
make it a high
adoptable.
risk from a safety perspective, but it's still something you need to consider in your risk
Mhm.
assessment and in your design, right? If you're designing a breast pump, I can't like no woman is going to buy a breast pump that's constantly leaking. They're going to get rid of it and get something else, right? They're going to complain. There's going to be
100% agree.
so
I just don't see how you could rate the severity of harm from that as high.
Okay,
Yes, it's
so
an
I actually worked for a
efficacy.
breast pump for 5 years, guys, and this was our number one complaint. From a risk perspective, there is zero harm, so it's not a high risk
Right.
from a harm perspective. It is a high trend for complaints and customer feedback.
Right.
And so, yes, that is a consideration, but I did this for 5 years, so we did not report leaks, but they were our number one complaint for breast pumps.
But it's a technical complaint, right? So you will submit it as a device
It's a user
deficiency
needs.
or
No, you did. We actually decided that it was not reportable. It was a malfunction in that, but the problem was it's not just the malfunction of leaking of the device. It is the fit on the women's breast. It's a ton of factors in it. So we as a company decided that leaks were not reportable. The FDA supported it. They never questioned our decision on that. And we kept doing design changes. It was our number one issue. We were always looking at it. So it wasn't being ignored as a company, but the approach was accepted. I mean, I went through 3 FDA audits and they didn't challenge the non-reportability of that.
yeah, I think I think the key thing there is that you worked
Yes.
on the design, right? Based on the
I have
complaints.
also worked for Medela. In Greece, we have sold breast pumps, and I remember that we have created one very good training for the ladies because we have two scenarios. The scenarios where the breast pump comes home, or they, in the first phase, they use it really with one support. So it is really, you can eliminate a lot of risks by the correct use, yeah? If you receive this training, let's say, before you start to use it. That is what I wanted to add, yeah.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
I just
I
want
mean,
to be cautious that we like make statements that can be cascaded throughout the organization. And I think it's really based on the product. But your intent is, I think the example is that we didn't test it with women doing clinical trials, which this company did. We tried it with various age groups, various breast size, all kinds of different factors on it. Because believe it or not, all the men's wives were pregnant and had different kids. So it just kind of was,
yeah,
they
I
were
think
great trials and stuff like that. So,
yeah,
but I just
I
want to be
think
careful that you make that kind of a blanket statement.
sure. I understand that. I think the point here is just to, it sounds like your company did everything right here, right? So you tested it on women, obviously, because that's who's using the device. You've received complaints, you're consistently working on the design to fix it, you're working on training, right? These are all the things you should be doing.
Right.
What you don't want to happen is for them to say, okay, this isn't an issue. We're not going to do anything to minimize this risk.
Yes,
Or
I
we're
agree.
going to do very little to minimize this risk because after all, it's just a little bit of spilled milk. No big deal.
Can you repeat, please, how exactly was the leakage to understand it a little better during the, let's say, the application of the connection part for the breasting, for the pumping process? There was the leakage, or in one other component of the device?
Yeah, I don't have the specifics here because it wasn't me.
Because it's important,
Yeah,
because the way how you applicate that on the breast, yeah,
sure.
it plays you have to create one vacuum practically, yeah. And it is important that you follow the steps. First of all, you have to apply, as far as I remember, one gel, and of course you have to clean, yeah. But it is one process. I must look back and maybe in the next session I can bring it, this brochure, yeah.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah,
this,
yeah.
I didn't mean for us to get kind of, I understand there's a lot happening here. The point here is that just because it doesn't seem like a big deal doesn't mean it's not to the user, and that you should consider that in your risk management and in your design, right? So
Yeah.
you should be putting controls in place for things like this, even if it's not a major safety issue, because it is still a major issue to the user. That's, I think, the point I'm trying to make here, right?
Yep.
So, you know, you have to think about risk and how it relates to the different populations for your device, and make sure that you're designing in a way that benefits the different populations as robustly as possible.
And what classification is the breast pump? And like the
It's class
US?
2.
Okay,
Class 2.
got it.
Okay, good
Well,
discussion.
it's class 2 in the US. I think there's other countries where it's not even considered a medical device.
Yeah, understood.
Okay, post-market surveillance. So if you assume everything is the same, you will not be looking for any differences. So, you know, I think complaint handling processes need to allow for the disaggregation of data to help identify differences in populations. So between male users and female users, if this is not possible, you're not going to be able to detect trends between your different user populations. And again, this can kind of feed out of the risk assessment. If you've done your risk assessment in a way that accounts for the different populations using your device, or that your device is intended for, then that will tell you if you need to be disaggregating your data in the PMS stage. But if you treat your device as sex neutral the entire way through the process, then you're not going to be able to see specific trends based on user. And here's just some examples of where we see kind of a gap in data for women's health and med tech. So hypertensive disorders in pregnancy are linked to a 40% higher risk of atrial fibrillation and more aggressive coronary artery disease. But there is no postpartum care that determines or considers long-term effects of HDP. So women who have hypertensive disorders while they're pregnant get discharged, go through their postpartum visits as if nothing is different, and they're never followed up on from a cardiac perspective. Second example is algorithms for cardiovascular disease were specifically designed with men in mind. So even when they went back and added female indicators like menopause, pregnancy history, etc., they don't perform as good on women as they do on men. And this can be really be extrapolated to any condition where AI is front and center. So if you're trying to add in things at the end of your AI and it wasn't designed that way from the beginning, you can see some issues with bias introduced. All right, regulatory landscape. So, you know, I think a lot of the topics that are kind of hot right now for women's health really end up at the complex and higher risk areas of our regulatory landscape. So, cancer detection and monitoring, you know, we're seeing a lot with breast cancer and HPV, non-invasive prenatal testing, over-the-counter technologies. We're seeing a lot with implantables for hormone regulation and birth control, artificial intelligence, and cardiovascular disease. So all of these things end up higher risk, you know, both with MDR and in the US, FDA. So, you know, there is a little bit of a higher regulatory burden for those higher risk devices. And then we kind of touched on this in the beginning, but it's really unknown how recent political decisions are going to impact women's health initiatives. You know, I think there's been a lot in the last 10 years in terms of gender and diversity initiatives that are kind of up in the air right now. And I think we can expect to see a decrease in government spending on research for women's health just based on the events of recent. And this is pretty US centric. You know, I don't think the same is true for Europe But in the US, I think we will kind of see some of these things roll back. And I don't know if anybody else has seen this, but this is the disclaimer that has been added to certain FDA guidance documents that mention gender. And so this kind of gives a look into how the current administration feels about this path forward. So this is on the currently on the website for the guidance on AI bias in medical devices and the diversity action plan guidance. It may be on others that I'm not aware of.
What practical implications will this have?
Yeah, so it's hard to say. You know, I think what we're telling clients right now is keep doing what you're doing, you know, do the right thing for your patients and for your populations. You know, before the diversity action plans were a thing and before, you know, some of this guidance got put into paper, FDA was still concerned about this, right? They were still raising concerns in submissions when there was populations that were missing or when the data wasn't disaggregated appropriately. So I think, you know, focus on what's best for your patients and their populations and less on what the administration thinks. And I think we'll all end up on the right side of this.
Michelle?
I've got a wild story that happened to me last month. I was working with a company that makes pelvic wands, you know, both just plain ones and not and vibrating ones and hot and cold and, you know, like all the features across their product line. They got a untitled letter. They got an untitled letter from the FDA that says that they need to see their 510Ks because pelvic wands for vaginal use exceed the exemptions in the regulation for the device. And I'm like,
Repeat that?
because it just says genitals in the regulation.
Yeah.
And there are 4 510Ks, all from before the 90s or before. And all of them were for penile dysfunction, like erection dysfunction. And so the FDA was pursuing this company because pelvic wands are for men. That's what they said.
That's crazy.
It was obscene, like what they were saying. And I like went back all the way in the Federal Register, all the way to the first proclamation of that regulation in 1979. And 1979 specifically calls out not only vaginas, women's pelvic floor, vagina this, female, like it was at least in 3 or 4 different places in the proposed rule. Then in the final rule, like a year or 2 later, well, because I found that in Federal Register too, 2 people had commented to the proposed rule saying that they really don't want, they use vibrators for the pains in their legs and calves, and they think it would make that use too difficult to underneath that regulation. And the regulation specifically said vaginas. So the FDA, to address those 2 comments, said, okay, we're going to make this like more, we're going to change the wording here to be clear that this is not supposed to be used like on your leg. And the way they changed it was instead of saying a vagina, female, whatever, they just turned it into for use in genitals only.
When was this?
1980. So fast forward somewhere along the way between 1980 and I can't remember the year the first penis erection thing had a 510K. It gets down classified to not needing a 510K for, you know, unless you exceed exemption. So my argument is those 4 for penises exceeded the exemption because they were penises and it was for vaginas, and that is a different intended use. And FDA said, but the precedent is that the penises have 510Ks. So once the exemption is in place, the only people who can use the exemption are the people that have the same intended use as who is in the 510Ks. The regulation was never for penises. It is in an obstetrics and gynecological product code. And in that meeting, I was trying to like not talk because I was in it.
How well
I
did
was
you
supposed
do?
to be the quality man. I was supposed to be the quality person and
How well
just
did you
show up.
do in hiding your meta messages?
Yeah, no, I had to also turn my camera off because of the faces that I was making. It was just,
Carrie, you
so
have something to
at one
contribute?
point, I just could not say anything. And I just said, because the FDA threw out, well, because the client was saying, well, why don't you have, like, you just need to do a mass, and it's going to be easy to identify a mass industry notification. Because you're creating like this business thing, like where you're coming after me, you're to shut my business down. But this is like every single company except for the 4 that have penises should not be, are all illegally marketed. And they're like, well, our resources this, and we have limited resources. We can only deal with what people report to us, blah, blah, blah. And it was all bullshit too. And I turned my camera on. I said, you guys have used limited resources of the FDA about 6 times now, but for the limited resources you have, this is really the highest risk to women's health that you guys have got the capacity to pursue right now. And I said, I'm not even speaking as a regulatory expert right now. I'm speaking as a woman that I find that offensive. And then I didn't say anything. So, but I've just been so close. I still may call and ask him if I can do this, but I want to write up a case study and send it in, like, okay, if here's one of the 10 you need to repeal right now. Like, if you got to pull 10 out, start here, because this is some nonsense. And I also find it offensive how much resources are being dedicated to this, because it was also clear that the FDA was going after other companies, but they couldn't talk about it.
Kel is unhappy. But thank you for sharing that.
Sorry, I digress.
Okay.
But I think it's, my point is to this slide, I think it's fascinating that they're going to put that up and then do this at the same time.
Harry, go ahead and unmute yourself. You had some background noise. I know you have something to contribute. You know how? I wouldn't push the answer. There we go.
I'm at Starbucks. It's really loud. Sorry. I was just going to have a happy story that the NIH just actually granted one of my female health, their grant, because it's for female health. That's all. It was a quick
Awesome.
happy story. I know. They were like, put it on hold, and then they just granted them their NIH grant for SBIR1. So that's all.
When was
I'll go
that?
back on you. Huh?
When was that?
Yesterday.
Congratulations.
Happy story. But it's for a female sexual dysfunction device for PK. So
Right.
I'll go back on mute because it's loud.
Okay. What I'm not following is like Carrie's example where there's something for female sexual dysfunction. And are you saying that the interpretation by the FDA was this is somehow in violation of
NIH, not FDA, the OBGYN branch right now is being freaking ridiculous. I agree with Michelle on that because I've had another one where it was for a male clip and it said male penis for female incontinent device. And because the regulation states male penis incontinent clip, however, every single freaking OBGYN for female incontinence device has been using this product code. However, the regulation, which everybody knows intended use is how you go down the the list. However, it says penile incontinence clip because it refers to a penis. The current OBGYN people we have in place right now said, well, it says penis in the regulatory group. And I got into it and I'm like, it's in the regulation. And we all know it takes an act of God to change the regulations, and look at all the intended uses right now. So we went head to head. I went with the current green group that's in place right now at the NIH, or not the NIH, but the FDA OBGYN group. So Michelle, I'm with you on right now with the current.
Yeah, and
Anyway,
so
going back on mute.
the next part that is shocking about that is they flat out told him that, yeah, you know, you have to get a 510K, but once you get a 510K, none of your competitors have to have a 510K after
were
that, because
all
then you are the
reduced.
precedent.
They were all down classified per the Cures Act. All of those devices were down classified and for the Cures Act. They're all 510K exempt. They're all, anyway, sorry.
No,
No,
I mean-
great discussion.
Oh, thank
Um,
you for that, Carrie, because that was the last place where I was like trying to scavenge the Federal Register, and I couldn't find where it was down classified specifically by
They were
individual
all in the
contract.
Cures Act. They were all down
Nice.
classified
Thank
in
you.
there, and I have all of them. If you need them, I have the whole.
I would appreciate it, because
Yeah, I have everything
I'm on
you
a
would need
soapbox
in
now.
my. Yeah, I'll give you my soapbox too on that one
Oh,
because I have
I'd love
them
it.
all. Okay.
Yeah.
let me share what's going through my filtered brain. Some weeks back, I made a comment that one of our family members found biased and offensive. And so I'm trying really hard not to let my liberal side show. However, the reason I nurtured this group was so that we can lift up industry and we can do something positive. Longtime friends might remember I created a website called No 2.3 back in 2012. And it was because of the medical device tax, and we garnered 11,000 signatures. And to this day, John Ekberg insists that that's the reason that got turned away. It's hard for me to believe, but he said that there was this huge map with, spots of where people in the country had signed this thing from. And it was such a visual that our legislators were like, well, shit, this isn't just a Minneapolis thing. And they began to talk about, I find it hard to believe that had that kind of impact, but he insists that it does. I'm wondering in this environment, if there's any kind of reasonable expectation that a concerted campaign to fight for women's health initiatives on this Women's Health Month and others could be expected to have a positive outcome or an influence. What does the group think about putting in the effort versus, I know it's, you stand and I'll put myself on mute now because I want to keep friends. Anyone dare to comment?
I would think, Joe, if we went back to her previous slide about what's trending in women's health, the kinds of devices, and we were to look more, yeah, right there, cancer detection, non-invasive prenatal testing. I think you'd almost need to be addressed at the therapeutic category level. I think that really it's like, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? And that, getting the manufacturers aligned about what their priorities are around their specific therapeutic category. To me, that would probably be the most effective approach rather than sort of blanket making it, you know, women versus men kind of thing, but really like in this particular field, we need to protect women. We need to make sure that there's representation, that there's a lack of bias, that sort of thing. That's my opinion.
Anyone else?
I agree with Sean, but I think if we start with one item, maybe we can make a difference. Because there's too many things. So which one will be most important?
And do you have an opinion or?
So my opinion, it's I guess none of these. It's mental health. Because after the pandemic, everybody's alone. So if we
I'm
start,
sorry, after the pandemic, everyone's,
everyone is alone. So we are all segregated to our computer screens, or you know, we are inside our homes, or people have returned to normal life, but a lot of people have not. So if we start with one topic and, you know, we can decide what it is, then we can combine to focus the attention on one thing, because there's too many things that are related to mental health. Everything starts with how you eat, how you feel, in my opinion. I know there's
before I let you go, just let me understand, is that a gender specific issue? I understand that's an issue, but since we're talking about women's health,
it
is
is
what you just said
Yep.
related specifically to a gender?
yes.
I think that women and men respond differently to that kind of trauma. So
Maybe we need to
understand where
follow up
she's
offline because I'm intrigued.
well, I want to make sure that our guest gets to get through her presentation.
Oh, I'm done. That was the last slide.
Oh, okay. I just
Ending
want,
it with a bang with the.
okay. I
Certainly
just wanted to
was.
make sure.
You
Um,
put
There
it
is
out
still a hand up, so do we?
You can, Stephen, I know you're on the ready if you have a link to
First of all,
your site or something.
totally
that
agree with you. Currently, I'm working on an XS finger cuff. We use finger cuffs for blood pressure measurement, and the original sizes were designed around the people who worked there at the time. So predominantly male, and we have an L size, M size, and S size cuff. But the S size cuff will not fit on a large group of women. So that's exactly how it worked from years ago. But I wanted to say that even if you have all men's clubs, you can still make. Let me see. Joe said I could share my screen. Where is it?
Yeah. I believe it's as simple as you hitting the share button on the bottom.
Fibromyalgia.
Here. Okay. And this one. Can you see it?
No. Let's see if I need to do something too.
Yeah. No, this is
Here we
it.
go. Yeah.
Here we go. We made devices to measure EMG, and there was a professor in Houston, Professor Zhang. He used our grids to wrap it around the pole and put it into a vagina to measure pelvic muscles, because a lot of women have pain when they contract those muscles, when it's like how do you call it? Well, it contracts too much, and especially when having sex, it's painful. So a lot of people won't have sex. So what then the original procedure is then that they use Botox to tone down a few of those pelvic muscles.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a side effect to it that a lot of those women get incontinent. So what Professor Zhang found out is that if you measure your pelvic muscles and you find out where the nerve endings are, where the motor end plates are, you can use much less Botox, and you get the same effect that it relaxes the muscle, but you don't get incontinent. So we were all enthusiastic. And then they said, well, for $100 or $250 per probe, I cannot sell this. Can you design it for less? And together with the director of Postorama, I designed this one, which is, it's not really, the design goal was $10, and I think we're now at 12, so it's not too far off. But it's not really, also not really disposable. It's more like a single person use. So you can use it once, lay it aside, and then when there's a follow-up procedure, you can use the same device if you like. So, and this one is well, I think it in the design, as a design, it's a great success because we used in-mold labeling. That's the same thing you do with like margarine cups or ice cream cups, where you have the printing on the outside. But what you do is you put your printing inside an injection molding machine, the plastic from the inside. So, and this way, because the electrodes were a little bit recessed, you can put some electrode gel in it. And also if you put some more gel in, it's like a lubricant, which makes it easier. So out of a design perspective, I think it's one of the great successes ever. But then the company who ordered these, they had no idea how to put something to market. So I guess they got a grant from, I don't know where. And as I see, they still have a website about us, Hilmet. But as you see at the development milestones, they end in, I guess they made it before Q1 2023. So I guess it just went up in smoke. And it's I think it's an example of you do something with the best intentions, with the best engineering ever, but there are so many other factors that can prevent it from being making it a success. It's sometimes a shame. I guess if those guys were a member of this group and they would have learned a lot from all the people, then this could maybe could be a success. And I don't think there it's on the website from Postorama. So there was we thought about having a patent on it because it's really a very elegant way of making a lot of electrodes on the outside of a surface. But that is on display right now means that there's probably not a patent on it. So everyone who sees it now can run away with it. So that's what I wanted to share.
Well, run away with it, how far? Because you say run away with it, but if initiatives like these are going to find a lot of resistance, then they'll run away with the same frustration that these folks have.
You know, I looked at their business plan and they say how they want to fund it is like getting money from the Botox factories, manufacturers. But then if you use less Botox, how do you want to make money from Botox manufacturers? It doesn't work that way. So they had a totally awkward business plan. Okay.
I get that.
You can stop me sharing because I can't
I'll
do anymore.
I think I can do that, or you can probably undo that. Okay.
But it's also to say that I think a lot of men are working on women's health medical devices, and of course you try to attract as many women to your development as possible. But it's still a matter of fact that in engineering there are not a lot of women working.
Yeah, and I think half the battle is just recognizing the considerations, right? And I think a lot of men are doing the right thing and are doing what needs to be done. Just keep going, right?
John, you just shared a link in the comments.
Yeah, so this was to Luke's comment, they didn't really know how to bring their product to market. We're starting a new 2-part webinar series with 2 speakers. One is about nailing your value proposition to attract investors, and the next and to define your audience, and then the next part around it is really the secret sauce around, finding your right product code and getting your device paid for. And so I think that this is a really interesting two-part series, and they're going deep into some stuff that doesn't get talked about a lot. But I think this is exactly the kind of thing, Luke, that would have helped your clients understand the value of what they have and
But
how to,
3 years too late.
yeah, a day late and a dollar short. But there are other companies that are in the same position. And if you have clients that are struggling with these topics, then, I would encourage you to join. Anyway, that's my plug for the next webinar.
I've got to run, but I really appreciate you indulging me, Margot.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Thanks for a great discussion.
Yeah, okay, bye.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for especially our speaker and RQM Plus for introducing me. Stephen, thank you. And I think this is different than one of our usual topics, but an important topic. I learned a lot today that I didn't know. I've never heard the word penis and vagina used so many times on a call, ever. And but when you're speaking about gender, I don't see that there's any way around that. So thank you, everyone. And
Before we hang up, Margot, how many folks are in California? I know Allison is, but is there a hub there or is everyone working virtually?
Everyone at RQM pretty much works remotely. We have several consultants who live in California, Allison being the main FDA resource out there, but there are a few others. Lots of people on the East Coast, lots of people in Minneapolis area, kind of all over the country. We have some in Europe as well.
I'll
So,
send her a
and
note, but you have a poll with Allison. Reminder that we're going to be meeting actually 2 months from today, May 7th, right near her home in Newport Beach. And she's a friend of the family. I would just enjoy having her there, whether she hooks up with Sean and gets on the actual agenda or just graces us with her knowledge in the audience.
sure, I'll let her know.
Would be great.
Yeah.
Next week, we have Dr. Arlen Myers. He's a well-known figure in medtech, and he's going to be talking with us about the confluence of medtech and AI. So that'll be an interesting conversation.
Sorry to jump in with a last minute question. I'm transporting these kittens that are getting ice.
Sure, Patricia, what have you got?
Hi. This might have been discussed. Thanks a lot for this presentation. But I had a question that it might have been hit upon, but what about those that had gender reassignment surgeries, and how does that play in when they're building these medical devices? It depends on what the medical device is, right? But
yeah,
in terms of monitoring, like blood pressure and those types of things, and integrating that into the bias in AI.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I'm an expert in that, but I think you have to consider the factors, right? So, if your device if there's potentially differences for those people who have had those procedures, then you should potentially disaggregate them from your data set. Make sure you have a representative number of people, in your clinical trial or usability study, or depending on what the device is, appropriate for the device. I think how you then present that data to the agency may change over the coming weeks, months, years. And I can't really speak to that without waiting to see what happens, but doing the right thing for your patients and making sure that you're accounting for variables like that is always going to be important. So if there's health considerations that are different for those people compared to others, definitely you want to consider them.
Rama, you just shared a link. What's this about?
Who?
Hey
Rama?
guys,
Yeah.
I'm sharing a link to a company that's based here in Montreal. They're called Eli Health. I just find what they do very, very interesting. Haven't worked with them, but they're very strongly innovative in the field of femtech. So they're developing this technology that can detect hormones in saliva, and really putting patient monitoring at the hands of females, tracking all kinds of insights. And I just think it's interesting. A lot of the information that
They join wait lists, so they're not in market yet. Do you happen to know where they are in their regulatory?
I think they were pursuing, well, I'm not sure. I haven't kept up with their regulatory
Your company's not working with them.
No, but I just find what they do very interesting. The founder, I think, and her husband were facing some infertility issues, and so they're both engineers, and one of them was working on the hardware portion of this, and the other was working on the software portion of this. And I think it's just very interesting because they're putting a lot of the information that's unknown in the field of infertility. There's something called unexplained infertility. And a lot of times it can be just helpful to gain insights into how hormones play a part in infertility and the treatment of these kinds of issues. So just kind of new developments in the field. I think it's important to keep track of. I like to see
Well,
companies
you're a
like,
very welcome addition to our family. I'm glad you started to join us.
yeah, it's my pleasure.
Just a reminder, and it's been a while since I've done this, but everyone who's on this call has an expertise that can teach us something. So if you have a topic that you'd like to be our featured speaker, give me or Sean a buzz. We're booked through this month, but more weeks, of course, to follow. And we have, I think, just 8 sessions before 10X. So if there are any in particular that would be an appropriate lead-in to the topics that we'll be covering there, they will be especially welcome. So on behalf of RQM, Sean, and myself, thanks for joining us today. Make it a great week.
Thank you.
You all.
Bye.
Thank you again.